Let's get into the issues straight away and see. But let me give Kwaboji some time just on the policy rate that has been cut to 18, what it means for the ordinary borrower.
No, let's allow us speak on that one.
I wanted to even ask him, when Combat, my friend, took over as CEO for Tor, he gave us a timeline that by September they will start refining. I wanted to ask yes.
You'll be amazed. Thankfully, Combat is the man.
Yes. No, he's
the man, you know him.
He's my friend.
He's the man. He's the
man.
man.
What is the update? Have you started there? Because you're a board member.
Perfect. You
started
get there. No.
But you gave us a timeline.
No, you see, you look at it, you have plus or minus in terms of projections. And the gentleman and his team are on track. Okay. He's your man, so please.
Anyway, all right. So we'll see how that one, because it will be good that we start refining.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning to you. Good morning to my friends, and then good morning to our viewers and listeners out there. Now, last week, the central bank has cut down on the policy rate by some 350 basis points. Now, I've always been saying that one of the core mandates of a central bank is to maintain price and currency stability. And before the central bank can do this, there are so many tools that they use in achieving this objective of maintaining price stability. And one of those tools is the policy rate. Now, the policy rate is a benchmark rate that influence interest rates in general in an economy. And so if the Bank of Ghana, having studied the trend of the economic performance, have realized that inflation is likely to go up, then the Bank of Ghana, the central bank, will intervene by way of raising the policy rate in order to drain out excess liquidity from the system. Now, the policy rate, as I did indicate, is a benchmark interest rate, and so it influences the rate at which banks lend to individuals, lends in general. It influences their lending rate. Now, we started the year with a policy rate of 27%. At that time, the Ghana reference rate was at 29%. And interestingly, lending rate was around 30%. That was clearly unsustainable. Now, Bank of Ghana maintained that policy rate until the month of March, where inflation was coming down. And so the policy rate was reduced by 100 basis, was increased. It was actually increased by 100 basis points in order to tame down on inflation to 28%. And as at that 28%, the reference rate was still at 27%, and lending rate came down moderately to 29%. Now, the Bank of Ghana maintained that policy rate up until the month of July, when inflation actually moderated to 12.10%, and the policy rate was reduced by 350 basis points to 25% in the month of July. Now, as at that time, the Ghana reference rate also came down to about 19.67%, and lending rate also came down all the way from 30% that we witnessed in January to about 24.15% in July. So you could clearly see that anytime the policy rate is coming down, then the anticipation is that inflation will also follow suit. Or once inflation is coming down, then we need to reduce the policy rate in order to trigger some level of economic activity through lending to private sector. And then it was further reduced by some 350 basis points to 21%. And last week, it came down to 18%. I actually projected 350 basis points. So currently it's at 18%, whilst inflation is at 8%. Now, this is the thing. Most people say that once the policy rate is down, technically or automatically, the banks should also reduce their lending rate. But don't forget that the banks have already mobilized their deposits, in a higher interest rate. And so it will take time for the banks to really adjust their, lending rate. Now, once the banks, adjust their lending rate, what it means is that a lot of businesses will go to the banks to go and borrow and expand their, operations. If you recall, the 2026 budget was premised on resetting for growth, jobs, and economic transformation. But I've been saying that you cannot create jobs and grow an economy when you have lending rate way above 10%. That is, unsustainable.
Okay.
And so the only way you can create jobs that will be organically led by the private sector is to make cost of capital very low. And so the expectation is that now that, the policy rate is at 18%, lending rate hovers around 22% currently. The expectation is that lending rate will come down further. Even if it is within the teens, it is still high for, the growth that we desire. Secondly, one of the key indicators of investor confidence is cost of capital. Because once an investor decides to come into your economic jurisdiction with his capital, one of the factors that he will take into consideration is the cost of doing business. And the cost of doing business is largely influenced by cost of capital. And so once your lending rate is too high, it's a pushback for investors, especially those who want to go into the productive or the manufacturing sectors of the economy. And so now that the policy rate is coming down, we expect the lending rate to come down.
How fast can that be?
Well, that is not something that we can say here, but then
from experience.
Well, we can be looking at somewhere by first quarter of next year, we should see the banks sort of adjusting their lending rate. Don't forget that the banks will also take the Ghana reference rate into consideration before putting on their risk premium. A bank can decide to do 5%. Another bank can decide to do 6% or 8%, depending on, their risk premium. Okay. And so the expectation is that by the end of, first quarter next year, we expect lending rates to come down. Now, the governor, during the presentation, he made mention of the fact that he expects lending rates to be in single digit by the time he leaves office. And, this is not the first time he said so. He equally indicated in the past that banks should be ready to be lending a single digit. Now, the interesting thing is that when you take the financial of the banks, the interest income, which is their core, business income, is always in millions. Some are even in billions. The banks are making so much money on their interest income just because the lending rate is very high. And so the expectation is that now that the policy rate is at 18%, one, we expect cost of capital to come down. And if the government wants the private sector to lead the 800,000 jobs they intend to create next year, because certainly government alone cannot create the 800,000 jobs next year, it will be largely led by the private sector. And if the government really wants the private sector to lead that agenda in terms of creating the chunk of the jobs from the 800,000, then the private sector needs to grow. But the private sector cannot grow when you choke them with high lending rates. It's not possible. Most especially considering the fact that our economy is largely dominated by Ghanaian-owned SMEs. And so currently, if I go to the bank as an SME and they are giving me 22 to 25%, that is still high. You cannot do any business in Ghana where, let's assume that you've taken 1 million as a loan from the bank, then the rate is 25%, you'll be paying about 250,000 cedis a year. That is clearly a bit of an issue. And so once the economy is largely led by, Ghanaian-owned SMEs, lending rates needs to come down for those SMEs to, go in for the cheap fund, expand their operation. I've always been saying that when you allow foreign-owned companies to, dominate your economy, the day that they will decide to go, you create a vacuum in terms of jobs, you create vacuums in terms of tax revenue, you create a lot of issues. So we need to empower, Ghanaian-owned businesses in terms of, cost of doing business and cost of capital. In that case, the jobs that are created will be, domiciled in Ghana. The FX that the expatriate will be sending out every year in the month of May, June will also remain in Ghana. Because see, at the end of the year, once the foreign companies are making profit, their parent companies out there will be telling them to, you know. So we expect lending rates to come down, and that will also make sure that the investor confidence is also deepened and boosted, because once they are bringing in their capital, they will know that in case they need funds, they can borrow at a much more cheaper rate.
Well, this is good news, right? For the policy rate to be around 18%, and we are being promised that it could even go down further because the governor is looking at a single-digit policy rate by the time he leaves.
Yeah, I think it's a good news for especially businesses and even individuals who wants to expand their businesses, and I think it's positive, and we must commend Bank of Ghana. But when you look at the trajectory where we picked it from in 2016, it was as high as 27. We came down. In 2016, it came around 26. In 2017, 20. In 2018, 17. 2019, 16. 2020, 14.5. 2021 was 13.5. That was how we ended 2020, 13.5. So at that point in time, I remember some banks were doing even 16, 15% interest rates in this country. That is 2021. But in 2022, because of the hyperinflation, we entered 2022 with 14.5. But because of the hyperinflation of 2022, Bank of Ghana had to do a lot of emergency settings to push the policy rate up so that they will be able to control inflation. We went as high as 30%. You remember? That was in 2023. So in 2024, then it started coming down to around 26% that we left it for this government. 27%.
No, so in January 2024, it was 27%.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying, that in 2023, we shot as high as 30% because we had an inflation of 54% ending that year. So definitely one of the things that they do is that when the inflation is high, they try as much as possible to raise the interest rate to bring inflation down so that a lot of people will not go to the banks to borrow, so that there will not be a lot of cash in the system, so that they will be able to control inflation. So they did that, and again, we left it around 27%. Now, looking at where it started coming down from 2023, I am not surprised that it is now around 18. I am only surprised at the quantum jump, to be very honest, from around 23% to 18%. That's 350
250 basis points.
Exactly. So because usually you see that the jump will be 100, 200 if you check the trajectory. But 300, it means indeed we have stable inflation, which is around 8%. So I will not be surprised if the next window they are able to bring it downwards. And again, we will entreat the banks to at least also adjust, so that a lot of people will be able to go into the market to borrow, to expand.
Because they will be getting the monies from the central bank.
Yes, so if central bank is giving you, if central bank is doing 18, it means you can do 19, 20. Usually they don't do below what central bank gives them, because that's what they get from the central bank. So I think it's positive for businesses. How we'll be able to sustain it is the most important thing. Let's sustain it, even if it is the way we did it. You remember, as I read the statistics from 2016, it came down. Within 4 years, it was around less than 20% within the 3 years. It was in 2022 when we entered the 14.5, but ended with around 30%, because they had to do it to check inflation, because at that time the inflation was higher. Okay. And it was not really it is not the government that caused it, because 2022 came with hyperinflation. UK moved from 2% to around 11%, which was the worst in 40 years, the same as US, and almost all the countries across the world. Even Cote d'Ivoire moved from 1% to around 7%, over 500, 600% increase in their inflation. So Ghana started in around 15.1 in January 2022 and ended with 54% in that year. Okay. But they were able to really bring it down to around 23%, and the interest rate, the policy rate also around 27%. Now coming down, I think the most important thing for the businesses is sustainability, so that the banks will also be able to readjust and give the loans.
Particularly, I mean, what needs to be done to ensure that this momentum is maintained, that we don't go back to the hyperinflation era, coming up with the accompanying policy rate hike?
One such thing is the positive comment from my brother. When we are all positive about what is happening in this country.
Oh, really?
No, I appreciate it. Because I think that he laid bare some of the facts. And I think we know that businesses have applauded the government so far in the economic indicators, but they also indicated that they are becoming highly uncompetitive because they cannot compete among their colleagues across the globe. Because the cost of doing business is quite expensive. And you can only try to do that. And that indication has been given by the minister when he gave, the finance minister, when he read the budget, that yes, apart from fiscal discipline consolidation, we're also looking at how to bring down cost of doing business. And clearly getting down the policy rate as done by Bank of Ghana is a good indication that yes, because it's set as the basis for where most banks will depend on to be able to determine their interest rates and all that. So I strongly believe that with what is moving, what we are seeing so far, the consistency is clear. And I'm sure that once the right things are done, the discipline continues, consolidation continues, the trust will be built among the business community for us to be able to have some kind of cheap credit to run our businesses. I think the cry of the business community now is not more on the dollar, it's not on the inflation, it's not on, let me say, the exchange rate and all that. It is how do we do business here quite comfortably without much cost, because some other jurisdictions, they are getting as low as what? 2%. I remember having an interaction as the trade committee member with the Abusukai group of people. That was their cry. Yes, you are doing well on this, but how do you help us make sure that we get cheap credit, funds to be able to do our business? And I think that's where we are all gearing toward. It's a country we are running, and once we are able to pick it and we are making things better, we shall applaud the system and be able to support it run.
All right, thank you very much.